Okay, I think we're going to start now. We gave a few minutes for people to come in. My name is Min Sook Lee, and I'm the president of the Ontario College of Art and Design Faculty Association. I'm also a documentary filmmaker. I'm a member of the Asian Canadian Labour Alliance and also a member of the Asian Canadian Women's Association. So we are in a webinar called Asian Solidarity with Black Lives. And it's a 90-minute webinar. I'd like to acknowledge the organizations that are behind the webinar, putting this together. There are many organizations that came together to bring you today's conversation: the Asian Canadian Labour Alliance, Toronto and York Region Labour Council, and the Chinese Workers Network, OPSU Provincial Human Rights Committee and OPSU Coalition of Racialized Workers, the Ontario Federation of Labour Workers of Color Committee, the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, and those are the organizations that are behind today's webinar. And I'm going to give you some housekeeping notes. I'll be speaking with Winnie Ng and Carol Wall. I'll be introducing them. We can't see you, so what we are going to do is ask you to participate via the chat. And many of you can introduce yourselves on the chat sessions here. So there'll be a whole chat screen, and feel free, please, to introduce yourself so we know who's here in the room with us. I think for all of us, these are new experiences, doing community organizing via Zoom. And we're trying to figure out ways to make this a human experience. And oftentimes being on screen can be really alienating, and it can be isolating, but it's been extraordinary, the amount of community and political organizing that has been tapped into via these online meetings and these sessions. So I'd really ask you to just say hi to us, and we know who's here in the chats. Just pop in, say hi, where you're from, and we can start populating our chats with people saying greetings to each other. And I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge the sacred land on which we live and work. For over 15,000 years, this land has been home to Indigenous people who've lived and continue to live in relation with the land in ways that have been proven to be ecologically sustainable, vital, and deepen our humanity by honoring our relations. This land is the territory, the land that I live and work in is the territory of the Mississauga of the New Credit First Nation, the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Wendat, and the Huron Indigenous peoples. And today, this meeting place of Toronto is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. And we're grateful to be here amongst them in conversation with their history and continuing activism to ensure the values and practices that protected the land, cared for the people, and planned for a peaceable future remain very alive and activated today. And I'd like to take a moment of silence before we begin our webinar to honor the people in our communities and families and lives who have passed from us since the pandemic began. In your company today, I'm thinking of a leader in our movement, an ally to me and a friend to many, Megan Whitfield, board member of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists Canadian chapter, an equity vice president of the Ontario Federation of Labour, and the first Black president of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers' largest local, the Toronto local. May you rest in peace, Sister Whitfield. Our struggle was stronger with you in it and will grow because of your inspiring and steadfast leadership. Now you've joined us because we've organized this session to talk about Asian solidarity with Black lives and to make the links in our struggles and to discuss the broader context of dismantling racial capitalism. I'm really honored to be talking today with two extraordinary women who have been active in our communities and who've been very much leaders in the struggle for freedom. I'll be talking today with Carol Wall, who's recently retired as the Regional Director for the Ontario region with the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, where she provided grievance and mediation assistance in numerous disputes in a variety of industries and worked with unions and employers to improve their labor relationships between their bargaining periods. Previously, Carol was a negotiator with the Public Service Alliance of Canada, PSAC, until she joined the service in 2006. Carol was the first human rights director with the Communications, Energy and Paper Workers Union of Canada, CEP, which is now currently Unifor after CEP merged with the Canadian Auto Workers Union, CAW, in 2013. Carol has previously held positions as a national representative, responsible for negotiating collective agreements, presenting arbitrations, designing, facilitating educational courses, and the like. Carol represented CEP as part of the Canadian Labour Congress delegation at the 2001 World Conference Against Racism, Racial Intolerance, Xenophobia, and Discrimination in Durban, South Africa. And while working at the Toronto Star for 17 years, she was a national account executive who's also designed and facilitated sales training courses and was very active, holding various union executive board positions in her home local, the Southern Ontario Newspaper Guild, SONG, CEP Local 87-M. She was an executive member, board member of the Pay Equity Advocacy and Legal Services Clinic, PEAL. Carol is a co-author of the book, Education for Changing Unions, published in 2002, which won the best book related to the field of labor education from the United Association for Labor Education based in Chicago, Illinois. Welcome to the webinar, and thank you for joining me, Carol. I'd also like to thank and welcome Winnie Ng. Winnie Ng is a labor rights activist, educator, and community organizer with a deep commitment to anti-racism, equity, and worker empowerment. She served as the Unifor Sam Ginton Chair in Social Justice and Democracy from 2011 to 2016. During her term, she created the annual Ryerson Social Ryerson Tradition. Winnie is a former union organizer with immigrant workers in garment factories, the ILGW, and hotels, HERE Local 75. She was the Ontario Regional Director with the Canadian Labour Congress for 8 years. After years of activism, Winnie returned to the Academy in 2006 and completed her PhD program at OISE University of Toronto. Winnie's research focuses on the impacts of global labor market restructuring on racialized immigrant and migrant workers. Over the decades, Winnie has been involved in a number of feminist organizing and labor and community coalition building efforts. She's a founding member of the Coalition of Visible Minority Women in Ontario and the Alliance for Employment Equity in the 80s, served as on the executive of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women in the 90s, and was a former co-chair of Good Jobs for All coalition founded in 2008 during the global financial crisis. Winnie is also a founding member of the Asian Canadian Labour Alliance. Winnie is currently an adjunct professor with the School of Social Work, Ryerson University. In her spare time, she volunteers with the International Domestic Workers Federation, which represents over 500,000 domestic workers worldwide. Thank you, Winnie, for joining me, and thank you for being part of this conversation. Now, I want to give you, before we begin, I should give you a few housekeeping notes to all of the people who've joined us on this webinar. And I see so far we have 92 participants, and welcome to all of you. We are going to be asking you to fill a few polls as we move forward, just to get a sense of who's in the room with us. So please take a second to fill out the polls as they come up on your screen. It'll help us get a sense of who's with us, and also to gauge the issues and the ideas that are important to you that come forward. This session is also going to be recorded and made available for those who can't join us in person or in real time. So be aware of that and make sure you share that information about this webinar with your friends and with your contacts. So Winnie and Carol, I certainly won't be the first to be observing or commenting that we're in an extraordinary time. We're in a time of political, cultural, economic revolutionary tempo, really. A time with a lot of upheaval, tremendous pain and uncertainty for many of our communities. And for those of us who have been organizing in many different sectors, there feels to those of us that there's a historic nature to the political tumult and absolutely an opportunity for transformational change to be implemented. Change that's long overdue. And what we're seeing is a reckoning with the conversation and with action on anti-Black systemic racism and anti-Indigenous systemic racism, triggered, yes, in part by the police killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks in the US, and amplified here in Canada by the recent violence and deaths of Black people by police, from Regis Korchinski-Paquette, Abdurrahman Abdi, DeAndre Campbell, Andrew Loku, the recent police killings of Indigenous people, Chantal Moore of Clayoquot First Nations and Rodney Levy, the Mi'kmaq First Nations, and the shooting here in Toronto, Mississauga, of Ijaz Ahmed Chowdhury. In this context, people are rising up in the streets and rising up and taking action. And it's having a society-wide impact. It's opened up a conversation and action, not just about anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racist policing, but about anti-Black systemic racism within every sector and structure of our society. And it's necessary, in fact, to see police violence as a logical outcome. And some would argue as the enforcement arm of a racist system that is by its definition anti-Black and anti-Indigenous. Carol, you have spent decades working in the labor sector in communities and fighting this battle as an educator, as an author, as a union organizer, and a community activist. What do you make of this moment, Carol? I'd like to know your response to the moment we are in right now.
So for me, this moment is, you know, Min Sook, as you read those names, every time I hear a name, it's like a wound, an open wound. So for me, this time is very different. This time, is painful as it's been, is a time of clarity for me, as strange as that may sound, because the clarity that I've received as I've worked through my rage, and for those who know me, I am not a person of rage. I'm a person who, you know, these things happen, you know, you have to figure out how to strategize, but I have had such rage that I've had to work through. And for me, I've had to work that through and think about my community, that I know even having these type of webinars is traumatic, because again, we're reliving all this stuff that we've that we've been experiencing all our lives. And so I've got to hang on to the hope, because what I would like to say to my community is, we don't have the option of giving up. So as much as we have to take care of ourselves and work through this rage, but now the clarity that I see in this moment is that there is no going back. Between the moment and the inequality that has been totally unmasked with COVID-19, we must reimagine the world we're living in. And that must be a world that totally dismantles white supremacy, dismantles anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism. That's our starting point to imagine a world that we all want to live in. And so what my sign of hope is that the protests around the globe spoke loudly to the fact that we're not making this stuff up. You know, so there's no more, at least there's no more debating. There's no more having to convince people. It is there. It is there. And so now it's like, white folks, do the education, do what you need to do, because now there has been a shift and you see it. So what is very hopeful for me is the multi-racial, intergenerational participation in protests, basically most of them led by youth, that's been really the hopeful sign that I need, because in speaking to, you know, Winnie and other comrades who have been in this struggle for so long, our first response is, we're tired, we can't do this anymore. But again, we you know, because of who we are, we can't just sit with that either. So I had to work through a lot of different emotions. But what I know to my core is that there is no turning back. We cannot turn back on this. We have to face it. We have to, and you know what, for me, the clarity too is now I can have conversations that I've had in my head or I've had with my community that I've wanted to have with white folks, but basically didn't want to make them upset or didn't want to. So that's all gone now. We're all in this together. And this is when you've got to hear the truth. And the burden for me shifts to them now, because I haven't benefited from white supremacy. I haven't benefited from any of the white privilege. So the burden shifts. And so I'm hoping, because again, we still must do this together, that the white folks start doing the real heavy lifting for a change. And then we can walk in solidarity once they've done that and they start really dismantling and taking the risks that will be inherent in that, because the whole system, every institution, the foundation, if we think about a house being built, it's been built on white supremacy. We've tinkered with trying to fix that. There's no more tinkering. It has to be a total dismantling now. That's where we're at for us to go forward, and we will all benefit from that. All equity seeking groups will benefit from that, because we no longer can say we don't know. We no longer can say this doesn't exist. And so that has been a moment of clarity where at least I can have real conversations now, real conversations, and we can really move this forward, because we've done a lot of work, but given that we're in 2020, I almost feel I need to apologize to my children. So now the aim is my grandchildren, that they will live in a better world.
Thank you, Carol.
Yeah.
I have to say that there's a thinking I have about the times that we're living in which it took a pandemic, it took a global health crisis that shut many economies down, many sectors down, to make much more clear and more graphic the searing inequities and the instruments that underscore the inequities. And I'm talking about instruments and ideologies of anti-Blackness and anti-Indigenous ideologies that underscore the structures and the systems that we live in. And within the pandemic is when people have finally managed to break open into a very mainstream conversation all of the inequities that pre-existed COVID, but are now at play and out in the open today, and people are rising up. So I think about this thought, you know, if this moment doesn't radicalize you, then what will? Winnie, I'd like to know what you make of this moment, given your many decades of organizing and working in solidarity of Black communities, of Indigenous communities, and organizing in multi-intersectional and multi-coalition spaces.
I just want to echo what Carol has said. I mean, in a way, it's an extraordinary moment, a moment of reckoning, a moment of clarity that Carol has mentioned. And I must confess, I have mixed emotions, from being really enraged to being wary, and then extremely inspired. So like Carol, I'm inspired by the large turnout, the young people's initiatives in taking on organizing, showing up and be counted. And to me, I think this generation of young people are the hope. And, you know, as a longtime organizers, I see they are the leaders that we've been waiting for. So in that sense, there's that sense of optimism. I guess my cautionary note and having that, how do we sustain this protest movement to achieve concrete results that, and that to make sure these young people, these young organizers won't have to experience the frustrations and the disappointments that we have endured over the last over 40 years on a personal basis. And I must confess, like, I haven't joined in any of the recent marches, you know, beyond the COVID. I think it stems from a sense of weariness. It's, for me, I've been marching, you know, against the police killing of Albert Johnson, Wade Lawson, Sophia Cook, Edmund Yu, Sammy Aten. These are the names, you know, some of the names from the past. And I've seen how hard, you know, some of the members of the Black community, like Akua Benjamin, Dudley Laws, Charlie Roach, the Black Action Defense Committee, have worked in pushing for commissions, and then all the, even the Royal Commission on the Indigenous people, the commissions on the anti-Black racism over the years, special commissions. And then you have all these reports that's been written, and yet racial profiling and, you know, cases of police killing continue to happen. So it's that sense of, you know, what more, what else can be done? And I guess the other piece, it's on, in terms of the rage, it's, you know, in some of the protests, I've seen different leaders and officials taking the knee. Yes, much as it's a symbolic gesture of solidarity, I find it becomes a photo op when it's not followed by any concrete actions. You know, I'm saying here to all leaders and officials, it's enough statements, enough posturing, enough platitudes. It's what you're going to do about it to address systemic racism, to make Indigenous lives real, to make Black lives real, that Black lives matter real. And, you know, and that's what we are waiting for. It's no more just platitudes. And if you make a statement, you give us a bit of donations, that's not good enough. You know, concrete actions and plan to make sure we don't have to waste another generations of, you know, Black folks, Indigenous kids, and racialized kids' lives to get to where we need to get to 50 years ago. So I guess that in that sense, it's, you know, moving into the next step and recognizing that connections between race and capitalism becomes a real important conversation, particularly for labor movement.
Thank you, Winnie, and thank you, Carol, for grounding the webinar with some very passionate, honest, and unfiltered, you know, declarations of the urgency of the moment. It's, I feel that everywhere I go, everyone I talk to, people recognize that we cannot lose the opportunity for deep transformative change that is presented by the crises of this moment. Now, I want to welcome people who've joined us late. I believe we have 200 people here in the webinar, and more are set to join us. Every now and then, we're going to be asking you to fill out a poll, just so that we can share with each other who's in the room. And we want to know, you know, what community you're from, because this format we're using to connect with each other is in itself, it's constituted as so, you know, quite oppositional to community building. So this poll helps us get a sense of who you are. So we have about 25% of the people who are in this chat with us in the webinar are union members, and almost 40% are members of community organizations and union members. In terms of representation, this is very interesting to me, in terms of groups, that ethnocultural groups that people identify with. 5% of our members here in this webinar are Black or identify as Black. 54% identify as Asian, 14% as racialized allies, 5% as Indigenous allies, and 20% as white allies. So just to get a sense of who's here in the conversation with us, Carol and Winnie. I think that is really interesting to me. And it certainly, I think, gives me an understanding of how necessary this conversation is, but particularly how necessary this conversation is with Asian communities to think through the relationships that we have of solidarity building, but also to be honest about the different tensions and challenges we have in the Asian community when we're talking about anti-Black racism, and we're talking about what solidarity looks like and how do we manifest that and how do we move forward from symbolic empty gestures and statements into real action. So both Winnie and Carol, both of you have talked about the urgency of the moment and a kind of a fatigue and a frustration that for decades we have been talking about and pointing out to many of the realities that our children, and now, for many of us, our grandchildren are living through that, we had committed to fighting from a very early on. And I'd like to know from both of you what you think about the way in which the current uprising has managed to articulate very specific demands that shift talking away from symbolic gestures, shift away from talking just about diversity or multiculturalism and tolerance, which is by many been dismissed as ineffective and in some ways as liberal tools of pacification, to talking about racial and economic justice. And both of you have talked about the economic structures that are bound with anti-Blackness and anti-Indigenous ideology. And this means we have to challenge anti-Blackness and anti-Indigenous racism very specifically. It's not enough just to talk about racism, and it's not to say that racism is a meaningless term, but it doesn't articulate it doesn't address anti-Blackness, which is very much a theoretical framework in our society. And it's very much about an inability in our society to recognize Black humanity. For decades, we have seen Black people killed by police. In my lifetime, the very first time it came into, my screen, I remember the Rodney King beating. And I remember looking at that and thinking, how is this and how we fund and resource a department that is targeting Black communities and Indigenous communities. And in this movement, very specifically, I'm seeing the call to defund the police gaining popular currency. And it's been really spectacular, the speed in which defunding the police has gained traction. Once dismissed as too radical, it's now being openly debated and considered. Los Angeles, Minnesota have begun cutting police budgets. Here in Toronto, City Council is debating the police budget right now as we speak, and there will be a vote that's continuing in tomorrow. So there's an unprecedented momentum for justice that moves beyond symbolic statements, beyond reform, beyond more studies, royal commissions, a momentum for justice that's connecting policing to economic and political anchors that have historically left the status quo intact. So Carol, how does a call to defund the police fit in the context of the kind of social change people are willing to move and activate today? How do you think it speaks to this moment, Carol?
Again, I have to give absolute congratulations and to Black Lives Matter for putting this defund the police front and center and the shift that has happened, as you said, is at one time being radical. And I know even to this day there are folks that go, defund the police. What are we talking about? How can we defund the police? But again, if we're really talking about the urgency of the moment and transformation, and we look at defunding the police, it goes well beyond defunding the police, because what we're talking about is our humanity and how we want to function as a society. Do we want to spend $2 billion on police, or do we want to spend money on making sure there's housing, making sure there's healthcare is funded properly, making sure education is funded properly, making sure mental health care is funded properly? So if we come at it from that way, making sure that the fact that we in a rich country walk by homeless people, and that's okay now. Like, I don't know what has happened to us. And so what is in my clarity, what has happened to us is the same process that was used to dehumanize Black and Indigenous people, to dehumanize Black people from slavery, to make sure it was free, unpaid labor. And when it wasn't going to be unpaid labor, now we have to control them. And to keep that going, we have to make sure that we not only devalue them, dehumanize them, distort who they are so people are afraid of them, that people think they're not human, that people think they're less than. That is why the focus, because I know a lot of folks also think, well, wait a minute, there's also other equity groups. We have to fix this. Until we fix this, until we fix anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism, no one else is going anywhere, because we have to fix this. We have to reimagine how the world is structured, because I want folks to ask yourself, who benefits from this? Sure, a few people may, be in a better social status, but really, who benefits from this? A handful of very rich, predominantly white men are basically benefiting from the destruction and the inhumanity that exists in the world today, with the climate, with housing, everything you can name. So this is the moment, after being shut in our houses, if we don't have that clarity to say, this is not working and we have to completely dismantle it, I don't know what it's going to take. And that is a fear of mine, similar to Winnie, is that we're not going to recognize that this is the time. Because as I speak, you can be sure that the 1% and those who want to be 1% are lobbying to make sure all of the things and measures we've been put in place to try to help will be taken away, and we'll be back to austerity, and we'll be back to a bigger police budget, because we're going to have to police people, because now we're cutting healthcare, we're cutting education, we're cutting all of the areas that make a socially cohesive, healthy society. That's where we're going to be. So the urgency isn't just for my community, the urgency is for the world. The urgency is for Canada, the urgency is global. And we have to do this. And that means everyone has got to put their shoulder into this. Let us take a breath. When I look at the poll and those percentages you read out, Min Sook, I was not surprised to see that it's low percentages from the Indigenous and Black community, because we're hurting. We are hurting in a way, it's like, I can't even describe the kind of hurt and rage that's here. But in that, we are still wanting to make sure that we have a better world for all. There was Kimberly Jones who did this incredible video, which she basically gives an analysis of capitalism with the monopoly game and slavery. And at the end, she says, what you're lucky is Black folks are still looking for equality and not revenge. Right? I mean, because that's what we're still doing, which is incredible to me and speaks to who we are, that we still care. When I have the opportunity to sit with my Indigenous brothers and sisters, and they care about the earth, and they care about their communities, and they care about the land, And what do? Oh, they're against progress. So now is the time for us to really examine what kind of world do we want to live in? Because you know how long we've had that slogan, another world is possible, and it hasn't happened? Well, if it doesn't happen this time, I fear what will happen in the future. And the last thing I want to say too is that backlash for us has already began. Backlash has already began. So we need more solidarity from our white brothers and sisters, because it is here in a big way. And the rage that we're feeling, this, I fear what could possibly happen. I fear what could possibly happen, because this is different. This is definitely different.
Yeah, the video that you mentioned of Kimberly Jones is a very powerful 6-minute video that you can find on YouTube. And at some point, I'll see if I can put it on our chat session so people can link to it. It is incredibly powerful, and she's able to, build a comprehensive picture of so many of the ways in which Black communities have been targeted and have been, their fundamental humanity has been dismissed. And what was interesting was that what she said finally was, you are lucky that Black people are seeking equity, not revenge. When she said that, I thought, I'll never forget that, because that's a really powerful, powerful statement. And then just a few days later, I saw it on YouTube, and not her statement, but I saw a really popular comedian on stage use this exact same language. And I thought, well, that's exactly how appropriation happens. And it's happening in, rapid time, right before our eyes. And there's a way in which the times we are living in, it feels as though time itself is collapsing. Events are happening so quickly and with rapid development. And part of it is about technology, part of it is about the speed with which people are sharing information, and part of it is about the intensity of the moment itself. Now, when we talk about defunding the police, I think it's really important for us to, as you said, Carol, think of the broader ideology or broader vision and the hope that defunding the police is part of. It's a part of a broader vision of abolitionism. And it's a movement to abolish prisons and policing in our society, and to fundamentally transform the ways in which we relate to each other. Reform the ways in which we relate to each other away from punishment and criminalization and the exclusion of Black and Indigenous and racialized and poor people into a society of caring for each other, where we can actually start putting our resources, our creative, intellectual, and material resources in caring for each other and caring for the planet. Ruth Wilson is a scholar, and she's spoken out about the abolitionist movement as a commitment to divesting from police and prisons and putting our resources, as you said, Carol, into schools, healthcare, youth programs, and caring for the planet. In some ways, she said, you could see it as a red-green New Deal. And so for Carol and Winnie, both of you as trade union activists, what are the ways in which abolitionism as a movement, the goals and the visions are aligned with the goals and visions of the trade union movement?
I'd like to just comment a bit on the defunding of the police. In a way, it's not, and put it in the context of the neoliberal agenda, the austerity agenda, where government cutbacks has always been the pretext in introducing the privatization scheme. So from the conservative, the privateers, the right wings ideology, defunding, actually in the last 20 years, defunding has slowly taken place in our healthcare system, in our education system, in some of the community building that should be happening. And instead we've gone into a law and orders, public safety, and then forget and miss the whole part about prevention. And to me, I think it's in that sense, when Black Lives Matter using the word defunding, we are reclaiming it into a much more progressive usage of that word. And so in that sense, it's also saying that earlier, Carol mentioned about slavery. Slavery pays. Canada, as a country, is built on a system of white supremacy and systemic racism. They occupy the indigenous land to have free access to land, resources, and everything else. And then with the slavery, I mean, you can, not only just the labor, but the people that have died. And then you as Asian Canadians, in doing some of the research on, the earlier pioneer days of indentured labor from China, Japan, and Southeast Asia, South Asia, this is the same pattern. So in that sense, white supremacy and racism has never gone away. It's simmering below the surface. And when the time comes, be it a war, economic depressions, or a virus, or just police violence, then it just erupted and surfaced. And so for me, it's in terms of examining who benefits and who bears the blunt. I guess I'm saying, as an Asian Canadian, right now there's been some talking among the non-Black communities that all lives matter. And to me, I think that's failing to see the current reality that right now, within our Canadian system, only white lives matter. And particularly white lives who are in the middle class and upper elites, until we can have a system that is free of systemic racism, that we can dismantle white supremacy. When Black lives can really matter, indigenous life can really matter, then all of us can then benefit from a system that is free of all these chains and systemic barriers. Then we can talk about all lives matter. So it's recognizing, I think it's incumbent, particularly among trade unionists, to recognize that capitalism's divide us as workers, racism divide us, and add to that edge, sharpens that capitalism as another tool. And so for me, I would always, remember the words by Reverend Jesse Jackson. And he said, we might be divided by by race, but we need to be united by class. And it's in that unpacking that we have, I think the labor movement within the Canadian civil society actually has an added responsibility to raise the political consciousness, class consciousness, and build a labor movement that is interracial, that is progressive, and that's working class. And I think these are the pieces that it's a fundamental. And speaking on a personal note, it just sometimes is so tiring to always be seen as being pigeonholed, as an equity person, or going through human rights, sit on human rights committee, or going through anti-racism training, when we are the one who experience it. We are not the ones who needs these anti-racism training the most. It's the white brothers and sisters. And I think these are, when we have gone through some of our personal experiences, be it seeing my daughter being told to go back to where she comes from when she was born in Toronto Women's College Hospital, these cuts deep. And I think it's, and so in that sense, it's that empathy in standing in solidarity with the Black community, with the indigenous communities, that we need to dismantle some of these gatekeepers and the gatekeeping mechanisms, so we can really steep into a whole new way of transforming both the society as well as our labor movement. And I'm hoping that the labor movement can be part of the motivating force to move us faster towards a much more progressive society in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah, can I just add to that? It's a couple of things. first of all, I criticize the labor movement because I love the labor movement, because I think of when I think of the labor movement, I think of people like A. Philip Randolph, who had to organize, because my father was a sleeping car porter, had to organize a separate union for Black workers because the railroad white workers did not want him in the same union. And basically his view of the labor movement was the essence of trade unionism is social uplift. The labor movement has been the haven for the dispossessed, the despised, the neglected, the downtrodden, and the poor. Is that the case today? Is that the case today? Is that the center of what we think of when we think of trade unionism? Because that is what we need to center to make sure that we are the social uplift. And if we're part of the social uplift, everything that we've been talking about, dismantling white supremacy, the defunding the police because we have another community, this is the role. And that is why I got so actively involved, because the same social justice talks that my parents had at their table, because they were both activists and trade unionists, it was a natural fit for me to be active within the labor movement. And so that is what we have to get back to. I read this article about against the equality of inequality. And when I think about, we have done a lot of work within the labor movement. And again, going to my clarity, I remember strategizing, how are we going to get these designated seats, and twisting yourself inside out and having little talks and trying to make sure you had white allies to get, and all of the things that we did to make gains. But again, to me, that was the tinkering. And there was one quote where it said that the equal distribution of inequality is an apt description of the liberal vision of procedural justice. The idea that establishing fair rules will somehow make up for playing a game without equipment, experience, training, or encouragement. So all of these tinkering, these things that we have done to try to have a place at the table, so that my clarity is no more place at the table. I want a trade union movement that is the haven for the dispossessed, the despised, the neglected, the downtrodden, Black folks, Indigenous folks, an equal place, not that we're asking to be added on or somehow given a little space. We are the movement. And so for me, again, this is a time when if we're talking about transformation, I'm talking about all of it. I'm talking about all of it. And it would breathe new life into a movement that I've sadly watched sink and sink and sink, as instead of being passionate about those principles, it's about a career, it's about the middle class, we got to stop it. We have to have clarity now about who we're all about and what we're all about and who we have to work for. And, I get great inspiration, and I follow very closely Reverend Barbers and the Poor People's Campaign in the States, because it's a multiracial, he makes sure there is an Indigenous voice there. Everyone is represented in there, because he knows that's how we move this forward. When we focus on lifting this, we lift everybody, and we have a society that we can be proud of, and we want it saddens me that I hear young people even, saying, we don't want to have children. We don't want to bring children into this world. And I get that. So this is the time for us to really go back. What is it that we really need to be doing here and what transformation. And I think we have to be bold, because you know what, we're always, so sort of hold ourselves back, because again, I don't know what happened where being radical was a bad thing. Putting a vision out there that is transformational is a bad thing. That's what we need. And that's what I am so inspired about the young people, because they're putting it out there. And, let's have the debates but I am not going to debate this. I am not going to debate ending and dismantling white supremacy. That is over, done. So if anyone needs to have that, go do your education, because I'm not doing that. I am at the point where we need to transform this country in a big way. And if that means dismantling, defunding the police, which then that is what we need to do, because we cannot go backwards. We cannot go back. There is no, that normal might have been good for some folks. It sure wasn't good for the majority. So that is done, that is over.
And just to add on too, I find it's really helpful to have the label of racial capitalism.
Yes.
Naming the moment. Because I think all of us have been to meetings where, we raise the issue about racism and how workers are being treated, be it in a hotel where you see the front of the house, the skin color of workers going from, gets darker as you go to the back, from the front of the house to the back of the house. But you always have, be it academics or progressive labor activists, would say, oh, this is identity politics. We're talking about class. And I think it's important that at this moment, it's bringing the two, because racial capitalism actually sharpens and give us a better sense of the inequities that Blacks, Indigenous, Brown, and Asians, all the racialized folks have experienced. And I think this is where labor movement actually should take up a much stronger role in responding. And so we can go into some of the recommendations we all have here. So
I think I'd like to do that, because I want to recognize we have about half an hour left in this time that we have together. And I know there are questions that are coming from people who are in the webinar here. And questions that are very specific about, what are the concrete actions that we can do in our communities, in our spaces of organizing. And I know both of Winnie, you and Carol, both of you have been involved in organizing with many different unions over the years. And I want to draw in some of your concrete experiences organizing. And I'll just kind of preface that with what's happening in Toronto currently that's deeply unsettling and disturbing to me. And I'm just a bit of a trigger warning, because I'm going to talk about symbols of white terrorism and supremacy. So on construction sites in Toronto, 3 symbols of white supremacist terror have been found by workers. And I think, Carol, you and Winnie are both aware of this and familiar with what's happening. So yeah, 3 construction sites in Toronto, downtown Toronto, 3 nooses have been found. Mm-hmm. And that symbol has also been used in Vancouver against a Black bus driver. So what we see, and I think that's part of the reality of the moment, when people speak honestly and fight for material change, and do so, with clear apparent goals and impact. There's impact happening all around the world. But, we see statues being toppled. Finally, we see, finally these things that we've lived our lives with wondering, will that ever be addressed? These are trivial things even, the name of a maple syrup company finally being, changed. Logos that are racist and dehumanize Indigenous people. We're seeing a reckoning that is really, can be colossal and beyond just the superficial. And in that, the response will always be to intimidate, to silence, and to shut down and to terrorize. There's an image that's floating around social media right now of a white couple in St. Louis who come out of their mansion, and they're both lawyers, who come out of their mansion to, because there's a Black Lives Matter protest that's coming through the neighborhood. And it's a very wealthy gated community in St. Louis. And the white couple come out. The woman is brandishing a pistol, and the man has this, machine gun. And I think that will probably be one of the defining images of 2020. And in Toronto, we are seeing this kind of terror happening against Black communities and against people who are rising up to speak about anti-Black violence. And it seems to me that in these construction sites, these are unionized construction sites. I would like to hear building trades. I would like to hear Carpenters Union, Local 27. There's over 50 unions that are working on these construction sites. I'd like to hear them take a strong position against the anti-Black hate crimes that are happening on those construction sites. I'd like them to take a strong position and not just, a symbolic statement, but start talking about what are they going to do within their own membership. That's one concrete example. When we want to see labor leadership on this issue. Carol and Winnie, I know you have more ideas about what can be done in concrete ways so that we can see organizing in our sector, in the labor movement, be much more proactive. I'd like you to share some of your thoughts with us.
All right, can I jump in?
Yep, jump in.
I think it's all clear under the current racial capitalist system, workers are always invisible and disposable. And the pandemic actually exposes even that inequality even further. So my sense is the labor movement, aside from Min Sook and yours concrete suggestions about what the building trade movement should do, is I have a number of concrete suggestions. It's one, the union as an employer should do their own reflection and do their own homework, do an audit. How diverse and representatives are they from the top to bottom? That workers of color should not be just congregated at the bottom, right? And secondly, on organizing, I come out from organizing, you always see the low wage workers, predominantly racialized immigrant workers, are congregate in much smaller workplaces. And now with the COVID, the pandemic, these workplaces are gonna shrink. Traditionally, the labor movement has always, most of the unions set a threshold that, if your workplace is not over 25 people, it's not cost effective for us to organize. And I think that's wrong. That needs to change. If we're really gonna be there to represent all workers, then the 25, it's immaterial, it's irrelevant. And then in terms of grievances handling and collective bargaining, ask for each union, how within your unionized collective agreement and work grievances handling, how many race-based complaints or grievances get to see the light of day, get to arbitrations and get resolved in a way that would make the grievers whole, right? Many of them get swept under the carpet, get dismissed and ignored by either the stewards or the front line or the plant level leadership. And to me, I think this is where some of that sense of belonging within the union doesn't take place. I mean, there's a great slogan, in the labor movement, we address each other as brothers and sisters. If you call me a brother or sister, mean it, right? And then the other piece is on leadership. To me, I think, there's always an outcry that there's not enough pool of leaders, potential leaders from racialized community. And to me, I think it's not a lack of emerging leaders of color, Black, brown, indigenous, and racialized, but it's a deficit of space, mentoring, and positions. I would always remember, I think one of the earlier ACLA gatherings, we had a postal worker, and he said, he became a shop steward and racialized postal worker. He became a shop steward after 20 years working as a postal worker. Had it been, and he said, had it been a white brother, the path would have been much faster and much smoother. So I think it's important for our white male leadership to recognize that, stop manipulating and dividing people of color when it comes to leadership position. For example, they've learned as well, these white male leadership, that it would be seen as politically incorrect to run a white person against a Black elected woman in positions. So let's find another woman of color who is willing and able to do the bidding for us. Right? I think it's for us as people of color from the diverse communities, is we recognize how this game is being played, and we will speak up and expose such hypocrisy. It's not going to be same old anymore. Yeah. And last but not the least, it's in terms of educations. Carol has said it in the beginning that white brothers and sisters need to take up their responsibility in addressing the system of white supremacy. It's too often we have white folks either leaving the room in a huff or in tears. I think it's important to recognize that we're talking about a system, and they need to take responsibility just like everybody else, that to engage in the real conversation, be it challenging maybe, on race, privilege, systemic discriminations, and the political educations. And then last but not the least, I think the labor movement has a tremendous role in pushing for employment equity. The voluntary system at the federal level doesn't work. If we're really talking about red, green jobs for all, let's have a system. Let's move the yardstick higher rather than, I think rather than having 1-2%, I guess I'm just equally tired as Carol is. We are not settling for the crumbs anymore. And I think it's important that we use this political moment as well to push and to rally and just supporting each other and supporting the young ones that are coming up.
So here's thank you, Winnie. And I mean, Winnie's outlined many things, but let me just very concretely, here's the hustle. Here's the hustle that we've been under for too many years. The hustle is, progress is slow and you have to wait. And, Black people don't, it's a democracy. They're not coming forward for elections. So basically that's been some of the discussion as the barrier. So in this moment, because as I said from the very beginning, this is a moment of clarity, I'm calling BS on all of that. And I'm saying your system is based on white supremacy. I don't care if it's a union, I don't care if it's the government, I don't care what it is. That's the hustle. So these things, these systems have all been tied in to slavery, to capitalism, and that's how they sit there. So basically what we are saying now is no more excuses. You need to dismantle that. And that means rethinking all of this. And I am sure that there are people falling off their seats thinking, how do you ever think that that's going to happen? That's the moment we're in, and that's what the demand is. And we're not stopping and we're not going back. So, I mean, basically the hustle that we've been through, and it's, the tentacles of this stuff is so everywhere, right? I mean, it's messed up even relationships between, and that's why I like the phrase BIPOC, because it's Black, Indigenous, people of color, which sort of gives you the historical perspective of how this hustle has happened, because we start with the Black folks and we make sure we dehumanize them and have, you know, hundreds of years of unpaid labor, and then we will come in and colonize and steal land and ask Indigenous folks to be assimilated and dehumanize them. But the closer, and then with the other people of color, you know, we won't dehumanize them as much because they're closer to the spectrum of white, which is at the top. And that's where everything is centered. And so what I'm saying is no more centered on whiteness. We are now going to center on who we are as a people and make sure that it is true equality. That is what we have to do. And that is what white folks need to roll up their sleeves and start figuring it out. And I do expect leadership. I do expect leadership because, you know, leadership for me, you know, it's this, it was Randolph Robinson who I love this phrase when he said it to me. Too many people have come to do good and are staying to do well. They're staying to do well. They forget why they came. They forget who they serve. So real leadership is taking this on, knowing they're risking maybe not being elected, knowing they may be alienating some white folks who totally do not agree with any of this, but that's real leadership for me. And that's what we need. And that type of bold leadership will also build the labor movement, because that, to me, like I'm yearning for that. I'm yearning for that, and young people are yearning for that, because what's happened is many BIPOC have gone into their own communities and are putting their energy there because they're tired of being dismissed. They're tired of having a character assassination if they dare to challenge leadership or challenge racism within their unions. So it is time that all of this is on the table and we have this conversation and we move forward in a way that is going to honor the essence of trade unionism being a social uplift. That's what I want.
Thank you, Carol. Now, I want to shift the conversation to address some of the questions that have come up, and something that I think is really important for us to talk about, and both of you have raised it, it's about the hierarchy of white supremacy in itself, and the ways in which there's complicity and buy-in into the system itself, how Asians and East Asians, South Asians, how we ourselves have internalized racism and benefited from proximity to whiteness. And this is something that I think needs many conversations, and we're certainly not going to be able to address all of it, in one webinar, but it's a conversation that is urgent and must be had within Asian communities. And Winnie, I want you to, if you can, start with answering that. But before we go into that conversation, I just want to acknowledge that Jennifer Huang from Labor Council shared a solidarity statement from the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. And I'm glad to see it. I'm glad to see this letter. It's a statement by the business manager secretary of the IBEW Local 353, where it's a statement that is very much, a strong statement that is against what has happened on construction sites in Toronto. And I have to say, it's great to see that statement, but we need to see more. We need to see more than symbolic statements in solidarity. Actually, the statement doesn't even say, anti-Black racism. It just says racism. We need to see more that's pointed. And I certainly would like to see how many of the trade unions, start looking at their members themselves and how so completely white the membership is, how gendered the membership is, and how difficult it is for Black workers, for Indigenous workers, for women to enter these trades. how harrowing it can be to be in these trades. They need to proactively begin training sessions, proactively begin mentoring and changing the makeup of who the workers are, the members in these building trades and construction workers unions themselves, you know. So I want to just share the results of our second poll. It was very interesting here. Number one, we asked, should the union movement be doing more to address anti-Black racism in the labor movement and in the workplace? 96% of you said yes. 1% said no, and 3% said, I'm not sure. And then we asked about, you know, methods and tools. And we said, well, what priority actions can the labor movement take to address anti-Black racism? Education on anti-Black racism in the workplace and in labor, it's 10%. And, you know, Carol, you were talking about being frustrated, and I'm there with you. I share that, and I also understand that, and I see that in my own workplace. You know, there have been many educational resources that have been produced, many workshops, many training sessions. And in the academy, I was reading a note that a woman wrote in McMaster, and she's a racialized professor, and the university has just set up a committee to look at anti-Black racism within the academy and within the institution. And she said, thank you for doing so, but I'm not going to participate in this committee because I've been doing it my entire life. Mm-hmm. And I invite you to read. And then she pointed out to, you know, over 10 years of publications, seminars, workshops, trainings that she had been part of, had co-authored with many other Black colleagues, Indigenous colleagues, and said, please do the work. Here's the available resources. Don't approach it as an extractive exercise. And then I'll be part of it, you know, to review what comes forward. But frankly, I'm exhausted. So in terms of the actions that we offered, we asked, you know, do people think we should there should be education on anti-Black racism? 10% said yes. Committing resources to Black-led organizations, only 3% said yes. Support of Black leadership in our unions, 5%. Advocacy with Black Lives Matter, actions like defund the police, 5%. And then all of the above, 77%. Of people participating here, and I think there's about 200, agreed that every single action we've just detailed is necessary to see a strong labor leadership on. I would like to see the labor union flags flying in Black Lives Matter protests, in the defund the police movement. And then 0% said none of the above. Now, a question that's come up in the chat, but also we've just talked about too, Winnie, is about how within the Asian community, how we address anti-Black racism within our own community. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I think, you know, if we take a look at capitalism and imperialism, how the extent of white supremacy, it's in a way, it's a very much a global phenomenon, right? So including myself growing up in Hong Kong as a British colony, it's these ideas that seep in. White is fair, white is beautiful, quote unquote, right? So there's a lot of internalized racism that we carry and that we need to unlearn and unpack. And I think within the Canadian context, is the media has done a disservice in reinforcing, you know, the whole notion of criminalizing Black and Indigenous and other folks, in that sense that, you know, then it becomes an unfounded, ungrounded, but it's a fear nevertheless. And so how do we create opportunities, create movement building opportunities where people can walk together, can talk together? And to me, I think this is where labor movement can come in and be part of that change, part of that transformative change. Is how much within our shop steward training, for example, how much do we incorporate the notions of political educations, what kind of society we want? How much do we incorporate the notions of anti-capitalism, political educations, and introducing that notions of racial capitalism into our conversations? I think this is where the political the raising of political consciousness. And in these respects would help to unpack and unlearn. And of course, within our own Asian Canadian communities and the respective communities, we need also to do our own work, right? So on how the system has, the white supremacy, how systemic racism has impacted us, and that in the workplace, in front of the management, we are all workers. Much as we are from different colors, different backgrounds, we get the same shit. And so how do we build across the differences and engage in some really political and progressive and working class resistance? I think this is where we need to be, and Carol used the word bold. And I think we need to be even, I use Robin Kelly's words, we need to be revolutionary in our thoughts so we can be a bit radical in our actions. And I think it's now, if we take away all the facade, take away all the politeness, this is the moment where some real change need to happen. In the labor movement, we keep talking about unity, solidarity. These principles have to be built. It doesn't come just because I have a union card, membership card, then I stand in solidarity with everyone else. I'm sorry, it's not like instantaneous noodles that you only need 3 minutes to get it cooked and you can start divulging it. So I guess I'm, in that sense, it's the internalized piece. It's one in terms of, and recognizing that we are complicit in that whole exercise, in our privilege, in our responsibilities. It's how do we unpack, how do we stand in solidarity, but at the same time, how do we, be able to be quite reflective and confront our own complicity. And to me, I think these are separate conversations that need to take place outside the white gaze.
Yeah, Winnie, I know that this is something that Asian communities must have conversations on, and we don't have enough spaces to talk about, honest conversations about how being co-opted into language around anti-racism or diversity and inclusion. When we do that, when we are co-opted into that kind of language, and if we don't name it, then we are doing so at the expense of anti-Blackness. And I think the reality is, as perpetual outsiders, if and when we benefit, and when we do, and we do, when we benefit from anti-Blackness, what we are doing is that we're recognizing a co-optation of our own humanity, because we are never accepted, in the room or at the table with our own, complexities and our own authenticities. We represent a kind of a stereotype in which unfortunately, many in the community work to fulfill, these stereotypes that we're all familiar with: hardworking, non-threatening, eager to please, more palatable. And we have to name that, and we have to make the link between that, our seat at the table in anti-Blackness and anti-Indigenous frames and thinkings. We have about 10 minutes left, and I want to also address some of the other questions that have come forward, because I think they're equally important. And, it's about, how do we get our unions? And we've spoken about this a bit, but I want to speak a little bit more, because Winnie and Carol, both of you have challenged the labor movement, very stridently and very courageously. Carol, I remember you ran for president of the Canadian Labour Congress, and you garnered almost 40% of the popular vote. It's I'm sure, taught you quite a bit about what it takes to stand up for a leadership role. And how do we challenge that? Because when you look at the leadership of Canada's labor movement, it is largely white. It is still largely white and very much male. And what do we do as union activists to challenge that?
So I was thinking about when I did, and I challenged I ran for the CLC presidency because I had a vision, that was the vision that we're talking about, that included all of us, that was the social uplift, that we centered, that's what we were centered on. Because I remember at the time, we say the labor movement, and we say we're in solidarity with one another, but I wasn't seeing what we needed at that particular time, and especially now. But I saw that, especially as a negotiator, that employers were absolutely united. And if they wanted to go after, for example, pensions, you can be sure on every single bargaining table, they would have put about taking away a defined benefit program. Even though they were competitive with one another, they were united in that. And I thought, why can't we have that? So I was actually fortunate when I thought back to it. I'm sure, well, I know people told me that I had just committed political suicide. And I said, well, wait a minute. I'm running for a position. I want to articulate a particular vision. When in the labor movement did that become political suicide? When did elections instead of coronations become disloyal and something that we don't want to engage in, to actually have real conversations, like real conversations? So I was pretty shocked, but when you think about it, here's why I did it, Min Sook and Winnie, because I am one of the fortunate people that had solid activists, parents that affirmed me every day and prepared me for life. So, and they always said to me, walk through the world and be what you want to be, and don't let anyone stop you. So I'm sure there were many conversations like, how dare she? Well, as a matter of fact, a union leader said to me, we didn't choose you. And I said, I know, I'm very proud of that fact. It was a grassroots campaign for all the right reasons. And even though there were barrier after barrier put up for me to even get to the convention floor, we did it because I wanted to crack the door open and let people know that you can run for a position. And I did very well afterwards. So again, it was because I basically didn't even think about the barriers and the cost, because it needed to be done. It needed to be done to crack open a door. My only regret was, when you reflect on things, did I have a multiracial team to support me? No, because again, I took what support I could, and incredible white people in very privileged positions stood by me. But thinking about it and reflecting upon it, I know that there was lots of Black, Indigenous, people of color who supported me in the background and through finances and stuff, but they weren't part of my team because they weren't in the roles to be able to be part of my team. And that's what's got to stop. Every policy, every practice, local ways of elections, everything has to be examined now and ensure that you're not perpetuating the white supremacy that is embedded in your union. Because not only do you need to do it for the right reasons, you need to do it in response to all the harm that you have done to Black, Indigenous, people of color who have many internalized the racism without even knowing it. So that's other work that we have to now continue to do to make sure that we do have solidarity across all of our identities. So that's, that's another thing that we have to deal with.
Yeah, Min Sook, can I just add on one more thing?
Yes.
It's part of the question then. I think what you add on earlier, it's in a way, as an Asian Canadian, we are always either seen as a model minority or perpetual foreigners, right? And that has been always the case. And the COVID this time around, last time with SARS, the COVID this time around, the skyrocketing number of anti-Asian racism attacks and incidents, including a 92-year-old older man in Vancouver. It just shows that white supremacy is alive and well. And if we don't stand in solidarity with Blacks, Indigenous, and Brown folks, we are not gonna take it down. And it'll be, now that I'm a grandma, I want to make sure that my grandkids won't have to experience what we have gone through. And I think that's part of the motivating force. In closing, I just want to say that, it's important. We need to take the time to also write our own history, document our own struggles, our organizing drive, our resistance. I think this is what's missing in the whole Canadian labor history as well, that we are always being portrayed as strike breakers, as victims, when actually we are strong activists, all of us, that have survived and rise above it with grace and resilience. So that would be my my last comments, urging everyone who was, put our documents together, maybe act as a place for holding everything together, so our next generations, the documentation becomes part of the archival materials. But we need to do all that for ourselves, because anyone else doing it will be from their gaze as a victor.
Right. Move away from the white gaze and name it. Name what's happening. Carol, I'll give you the last word with this webinar.
Yes. Well, I would like to hope that we have emboldened people to speak their truth, and that because Winnie and I too are in Winnie and I have always spoken truth to power, but I also recognize that I am not in the workplace, and I understand my privilege, that I believe I have always been I have always spoken what I believe is true, and I've done it in love, and I've done it because I believe in the labor movement. I believe in the various community, and I want the best for all of us, and I certainly want the best for my grandchildren. But we must, the labor movement must center back on the social uplift, as Randolph and Randolph Phillip asked them to. That has to be the center. That has to be the center if we're really going to build the kind of solidarity and the kind of society that we all want to live in. The stakes are too high. We cannot fail. And I can tell you that the Black community, we are not stopping. This is time. This is lay down your lifetime for us. That's how serious this is. This is late, because we're not living. We're being killed. And we will not, I will not see another Black body sacrificed all on the sake of capitalism, and let us be divided and not all rise up. This is all time for us all to rise up and speak with one voice to say, we will not let this happen again.
Amen.
Thank you. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Winnie, for speaking. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and your analysis. Thank you for joining this webinar. It's a short amount of time. We only had 90 minutes, and there was a lot that people wanted to talk about. And I think that clearly there's an urgent need for action, but also for people in the Asian communities to start talking about our own personal experiences and organizing strategies. And I hope that, and I expect Asian Canadian Labour Alliance with other Asian organizations will make spaces in the future. Asians for Black Lives Matter is an organization in Toronto that's been organizing quite effectively. Get involved with community groups that are speaking out, taking very strong positions. Do a power map of your organization just to see, you know, who holds the power and how do you access that. Find allies and do coalition building. And I want to thank everyone for attending. Thank you very much to Jennifer Huang. Thank you to Anna Louis and Rickson for organizing this and inviting me to moderate. Thank you, Carol, and thank you, Winnie. And thanks to Labor Council as well. Okay, bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Solidarity.
Solidarity.
Solidarity.